I'm doing a very short introduction for Peter Thiel, whom you all saw on stage already, but a little bit on the background, meaning I think most of the facts are about Peter are very well known. I thought myself if I would have one sentence to introduce Peter, just one sentence, then I would say I proudly welcome the guy who revolutionized my personal dating life by financing Facebook. It's an amazing tool for dating, if you haven't realized that. But as I have a little bit more time, some more, maybe more important facts about Peter are, I think I can say he's a legendary investor, entrepreneur, and as you also heard, he's a very good philanthropist. He founded PayPal in 1998 and sold it already 4 years later in 2002 to eBay for some billion US dollars, so pretty successful. He then founded Palantir. You will hear the name, I'm pretty sure, much more often in the next years. 2004, which is a groundbreaking platform technology to analyze big data. And he was, as I already said, the first investor in Facebook. Besides that, you think, okay, he might be occupied a lot and have not a lot of time. No, he founded or started 2 other funds, Mithril, more for growth investments, and the Founders Fund for internet investments. And he also started a very successful hedge fund, Clarium Capital. So very busy business life. Aside of that, as you heard, he's very active in philanthropy and also politically very active. Why I really think he's a great guest of DLD is because maybe bottom line, he's a great thinker. He's one of the smartest guys I've ever met. He's original. Yeah, he's not just telling you what you have heard in 10 other speeches maybe before. He's out of the box. He's maybe controversial, politically, whatever. So it's not mainstream what he's saying. But I think this is the main reason why you will enjoy his speech. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Christian. I wanted to, let me just see where the presentation here is. I wanted to talk a little bit today about sort of technology, globalization, and the question of how we actually sort of make the 21st century a much better century. I want to make it sort of share a few broad thoughts on this question and then leave as much time as possible for some questions and answers and make it as interactive as possible. Now, let's see. I think when one looks at the 21st century, there are probably 2 major themes that one has going on. They're globalization and their technology. And what I want to underscore is that I think these are 2 very different kinds of things. In a sense, globalization you can think of as horizontal or extensive growth, and it involves copying things that work. And I think of technology as vertical or intensive growth, and it involves doing new things. And in some sense, we need to do some of both in the 21st century. There's a sense in which we're in a world that's very focused on globalization, but I think much less focused on technology. And in some ways, this is already reflected in the division of the world between the developing and the developed worlds. The developing countries are those countries that will somehow converge with the developed world through globalization. And so a place like China has a very straightforward plan for the next 20 years, and it is basically to copy things that have worked in the developed world. There are things China can copy and improve. It may skip some steps, so maybe you don't need to build out a full land-based phone system. You can go straight to mobile phones. There's some things you can do better, but for the most part, it's very, very straightforward. But for the developed countries, the question of how we actually have progress, I think, is a very different one. And I think the question of how the developed world gets better is one that's not very often asked in these fora, and it's one that I want to at least try to pose today. And I think that the developing world dichotomy, while it's on the one hand very pro-globalization and believes in a convergence theory of globalization, it is also implicitly somewhat skeptical of technology, does not believe that technology will so radically transform the world. And in some ways, it has a somewhat defeatist, pessimistic attitude where the developed world is the part of the world where nothing new is going to happen. And that's why I sort of picked this somewhat strange-sounding title of Developing the Developed World, because it's something I think we don't ask enough about how to make that happen. Very thematically, if we think about the developed world and how progress in technology can happen, I want to suggest that there are sort of 4 basic scenarios, and I think these are the 4 basic things that can happen with technological progress in the 21st century. The first one is that it continues, but at a decelerating rate. There's some sort of, we make some progress incrementally, but it gradually slows down. We eventually run out of new ideas. The rest of the world catches up, which is globalization, but you have sort of this decelerating arc. Sort of the even more pessimistic one is that it's just cyclical. Civilizations go in cycles, they rise, they fall, and sometimes the knowledge gets lost. This is what happened in the classical world, and maybe this happens again at some point in the modern world. You have even more pessimistic one is that somehow technology or science are a giant trap that humanity has created for itself, and that you will have some sort of runaway catastrophe, and so it looks like there's tremendous progress, but maybe it hits a wall and the whole system collapses at one point. And then finally, there's the most optimistic one, which is that things continue to accelerate in the decades and the century ahead. I believe these are actually the only 4 possibilities that exist. It's deceleration, cyclicality, collapse, or acceleration. And I believe that I would defy anyone to draw a graph that's different from one of those 4. And since we don't want collapse, we don't want cyclicality, even deceleration doesn't sound that great. This is the one we have to actually work for. And if you don't have acceleration, by negative implication, you have one of the other 3. So one of the questions is, how do we, how well are we doing on technological acceleration, which I think is the key for the developed world to progress in the decades ahead. And I think it is sort of a very, very mixed story. So, have we been continuing to accelerate in the recent decades? And the thing I want to basically suggest as my core thesis is that there has been continued acceleration in computer and all the computer-related technologies, but there has been, somewhat less progress in many other areas. And so, if you want to sort of have a sort of an example of a place where things are not quite have not quite lived up to the expectations of 1967, you can look at Star Trek: The Final Frontier to explore new planets, new star systems, new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before. And that has sort of devolved into a somewhat flabbier, a person with a bad toupee selling cheap trips to the Caribbean. And so while we don't want to, and of course, if we had to go down the list, there are sort of many other areas where progress has fallen short of what people had expected 40 or 50 years ago. The Nixon administration declared war on cancer in 1970, said cancer would be fully defeated by 1976, the US bicentennial. Today is 2013. We are 43 years closer to the goal than we were 43 years ago. That is sort of true logically by definition. However, almost nobody thinks we will have a cure within 6 years. Or if one looks at energy, there's been a lot of efforts to innovate, but the actual cost of fuel has gone up dramatically in recent decades, and there's still not been enough progress on developing alternatives to fossil fuels. Or even if you look at something like transportation, where you'd have a classic measure of how fast are we moving, and we are no longer moving faster. The Concorde was decommissioned, and airplane travel has actually probably gotten slower than it was 15 years ago with all of the very low technology airport security systems we have. So there sort of are many different areas where I think progress has been less fast, and we can at least worry some whether this accelerating trajectory is still fully intact. One sort of macroeconomic way to describe it is if you look at sort of incomes in the world, in the developed world, the upper right chart looks at them from basically over the last 2,000 years. And if you look at that, you would basically say, around 1750 with the start of the Industrial Revolution, where incomes were effectively $1,000 per person per year. They have accelerated tremendously, and that looks over a span of 200 or 2,000 years. It looks like we're very much in the accelerating technological civilization. But if you look at, say, the last 50 or 60 years, there's actually been a deceleration. And so the number I always give on this, if you take 40-year intervals, United States 1933 to 1973, 1973 to 2013, 1933 to 1933 to 73, that 40-year period, average incomes in the U.S. went up 350% after inflation. So, people saw progress every year, every decade in living standards. One year after another, things relentlessly got better. 1973 to 2013, it's gone up by 20%. It still has gotten somewhat better, but for many people, it's felt actually quite stagnant. We have not yet had a collapse or a decline, but certainly you can make a case that we are no longer in the accelerating economic zone, and there's sort of a question why that is and what one needs to do about it. And I think the macroeconomic fact of broad stagnation in incomes is sort of always the big data point that something's not quite working with the story of technological progress, or it's perhaps not working as well as people would have expected it to work in the time of the original Star Trek episode of the late 1960s. Now, it goes without saying that the one incredibly important counterpoint to all of this is the digital computer age, which has continued to accelerate relentlessly. Moore's law is still very much intact. Hardware has progressed, transformed in all kinds of ways. And on the software side, internet side, we've had sort of one revolution after another. And what I sort of, if you had to sort of synthesize these things substantively, and this is what as a venture capitalist, as an entrepreneur, I believe the correct place to look at is still the computer age, and still to ask what will be the next area that computer technology will transform and will improve. Because if you look at the last 40 years, that's the only place something's been happening, and so it's a safe bet to keep working on this. And I think that's what we very much have to continue to work on. But at the same time, as citizens of our countries, and if we want to make our society work better, we have to also ask, how can we broaden this out to start impacting more and more areas? And I think sort of the hopeful scenario I would give is that in the next decade or two, you will start to see the computer revolution exist not just in this alternate virtual world, but they will more and more impact everyday life. And there's the Google initiative to have self-driving cars, which again is sort of a computerization of transportation, which would probably represent the biggest improvement in transportation since the development of cars in the first place over 100 years ago. You have the area of bioinformatics, which is again sort of a very early stage, but it's sort of the computerization of biology to turn biology into an information problem. And if that can be done, perhaps we can break through the stalled drug development in so many different kinds of areas. There are probably ways that these technologies can be brought to bear on all kinds of things. But the businesses that I find the most exciting are ones that somehow involve the synthesis of the virtual digital world and the real world, because most of us exist in the real world. That's where value does reside. And I think even the great internet successes of the last 15 years have never been purely virtual. They've never involved purely a fictitious, alternate, imaginary digital world, but they've always had this synthesis between the physical, real world in which we're embedded and this digital world that's created to complement and help it. And I think there's a PayPal version of this, there's a Facebook version of this. When we started PayPal in the late 1990s, there were all these different attempts to create new virtual currencies and to create new forms of money. There was a company called Cybercash, there was one called DigiCash, there was one called eGold, and they all had this idea of creating a new form of fiat money in some sort of imaginary alternate online universe. And the thing we concluded was you simply needed to enable people to use dollars, and at the time Deutschmarks, or now euros or pounds or all these other currencies better. And so that the key thing was not to invent a fictional alternate currency, but actually to extend the way in which people were using the real currencies into this online sort of a context. And I think in a very similar way, people sort of forget how much of a break Facebook represented from the consensus thinking in 2004, because at this point Facebook has sort of become the default for social media. But before 2004, the vision for online identity was that it would involve a fictional alter ego. And so you would basically, maybe you would pretend to be a cat on the internet and someone else would pretend to be a dog, and we'd have to figure out rules how you would interact with one another. And this was the 1990s model, the early 2000s model. And I think the key insight that Facebook had was that it was actually about real identity. It was about real people and real identity. And if I had to sort of tell the Facebook versus MySpace history from the mid-2000s, it was MySpace was started in, it was about started in Los Angeles. It was about people who were actors. They were all pretending to be someone different from who they were. And the model was that the internet was going to be about fundamentally fictional people. Facebook started at Harvard. It was about people just trying to be themselves on the internet. And ultimately, that turned out to be the model that succeeded, which I think is sort of a very good statement about the world. We're not trying to escape from our world. We're not trying to let the world fall to pieces and create a fictional alternate world. And that's the model we need to somehow replicate in all these different areas, is to reintegrate the digital information age with the real economy and thereby to transform it. Let me end by sort of suggesting some other ways that I like to think about this problem. So to recapitulate, we have two different axes for the 21st century. There's technology, there's globalization. They're not incompatible with each other, but they are very different. And if you work on one, you're probably not working directly on the other. One way I've often described the difference between the two is that because globalization is about copying things, it's taking one and turning it into n. It's a scalability problem, and it's how do you take a new invention and scale it. And whereas technology is about going from 0 to 1. It is about being the first person to discover a new way of doing something. And what I want, the big sort of idea I'd like to leave you with today is that there's something very different about going from 1 to n versus going from 0 to 1. And it requires different approaches and different ways of thinking about things. As my colleague from PayPal started SpaceX and will try to do more than the bad 40-year space history. Elon, SpaceX, and engineers the closest thing to a magician that exists in the real world. And there's something about science and technology that if it's not miraculous, it is at least singular, because it involves doing things that have never been done, that have never happened before in the history of the world. So I want to sort of suggest what some of the challenges of 0 to 1 thinking are. There's certainly always this challenge of whoever the first person is, there's always something about it that's unusual, and people will think that it's crazy. You can't say it's going to work because lots of other people have done it. One of the ways one of my colleagues at PayPal, David Sachs, liked to put it was that he thought that great entrepreneurs were missing the imitation gene. It was that people have this gene which makes them imitate other people, and great entrepreneurs somehow were not that good at imitating people. And this is why creative people are often like wearing clothes that don't seem to be quite right, because they're not able to pick up social cues. They don't know what's precisely fashionable or precisely the correct thing to do. The people who are very fashionable fit in well to society, but they're not the stubborn people who keep working really hard at ideas that they try to get to work. And so there's a question, how do we create a society in which exceptionalism is not looked down upon, not denigrated, but in which it's considered at least borderline acceptable. I don't think it'll ever be fully acceptable, but just that it's at least marginally tolerated. I think the educational challenge we already talked about a little bit, but it represents something very similar, where the existing education system is fundamentally about teaching people things that everybody believes to be true. And education is therefore well geared towards globalization. If it's about learning things that everybody knows to be true, education does that well. How do you actually teach people to think new things, to have answers on tests that nobody thinks are right? That's not something the schools are geared for. If you come up with an answer on the test that nobody agrees with, you're not likely to get a good grade in the class. And then I think there's also sort of this narrative of how do you explain what you're doing? How does this actually fit in to everything? Let me sort of give one other cut at this challenge of technology. I've often thought that when we think about the future, the sort of simplistic McKinsey-style diagram, but you can be optimistic or pessimistic about the future, and you can have a view of the future that's definite or indefinite. And so optimistic is the future will be better, pessimistic the future will be worse. Definite is you know exactly what you're supposed to do, indefinite you have no idea what to do. And so if you have an indefinite view of the future, the correct answer is you always diversify. And this is what most investment advisors tell you to do with investing money in the stock market. You diversify and do a lot because you really don't know what's going to happen. If you have a definite view, you focus, you have conviction, you work on one particular thing. Optimistic, you have hope for the future. Pessimistic, you're afraid of the future. If we had to sort of combine this diagram to describe where we are as a society, you could say the US in the 50s and 60s had a definite and optimistic view. People had very specific ideas about the kinds of things that would get built in succeeding years. You'd have faster planes, faster cars, you'd build out various new types of things. The U.S. somehow lost its way, I would argue, in the last quarter century, 1982 to 2007. People were still optimistic, but they no longer knew why. It was just the machine worked on its own. It was automatic. The future took care of itself. Things would just automatically get better. And then I think the upper right quadrant, the indefinite optimistic one, is ultimately an unstable quadrant, and it tends to normally give way to the bottom right one, because if you have no ideas about the future, if the future is indefinite, you end up ultimately being pessimistic. Japan, this probably happened in Japan first in the 1990s, and it's probably the dominant zeitgeist in Europe today is this indefinite pessimistic one. China, I think you could arguably put in either the optimistic or pessimistic side. I put it in the pessimistic side because I think China thinks that it will be like the developed world but poorer. The optimistic version of China will be that it will be like the developed world, but wealthier. And I think it's an open question which of the two it is. I would put China on the more pessimistic side at present, because when you have a savings rate of 40%, which is how much money people in China save, that's normally because you're still very pessimistic about the future. But it is definite. They know exactly what they're supposed to do the next 20 years. If you had to sort of describe the categories, I'll just use the upper left and bottom right. So indefinite, pessimistic, the main thing you do is you buy insurance. You're going to lose money on the insurance, but you're just scared. You spend lots, you do everything, you diversify, you get insurance to protect yourself because the future is going to be worse. The definite, optimistic one, that's a world where you create new things. That's engineering, art, all the various creative things. Upper right is sort of finance law. That's what we had the last quarter century. There's room for that, but it was pushed too far. And you can't have a society where it's nothing but finance and law. You have to have more than that. And I think the basic choice that we have in the developed world today is, do we move towards the pessimistic, indefinite world where everyone buys insurance? Or do we somehow go back to the future, to something where the world is centered on the creation of new things, art, engineering, all the various creative disciplines? Where to start? Let me just end with one thematic thought here on this. So I often think you can ask three different questions. What is valuable? What can you do? And what are others not doing? And I think you should try to find something that's at the intersection of those three. So it's not good enough to answer one of those three questions. You need to try to answer all three. The Venn diagram intersection is not necessarily very big, but that's where all the value in technology, intensive growth, and progress is to be found. So anyway, it's not necessarily a big intersection, but that's where you should look. And if you want to frame it as two questions, I'll give an intellectual version of the question and a business version. The intellectual version is, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? And I've tried to ask this as an interview question. It's always sort of interesting. People can never answer it. Even though they can read on the internet that I ask people this question as an interview question, they still cannot answer it. And I think this tells you something about the conformity that exists in our society at present. And then I think the business version is an application of this, which is, what valuable company is nobody building? And I will leave those two questions as homework for you today. Thank you very much. And I think we have some time for some questions maybe. I'll take a few questions.
Thank you for this grand lecture. Please, come on stage. Go.
Yeah, here. Thank you. Hello. Hello.
I'll speak, Peter. Thank you for that. Thank you. Lucian from Brave New Talent. Last year, I talked here about the world going from capitalism to talentism, where the #1 currency is moving from financial capital to human capital. And you talk a lot about the future of education. And I think one of the really interesting missing points is actually how you can connect demand of talent to supply of talent, and that's the question for the education system. What new businesses that haven't been started yet in the education model, in the education edtech space, are you seeing that most excites you?
Well, I do think I'd probably get a whole long talk on education-related businesses. I think I certainly think one of the critical things is matching learning to what people can do with it, and to somehow turn education from an indefinite good where people often learn and they don't have any idea why they're learning things, into something, something more applied. I'm not against general education or having sort of a broad baseline, but I do worry that when people say that they learn how to learn, or they're learning things that are very abstract, but, and that it's sort of bad to ask how it might be applied, that this is often has become an excuse, and we need to push back on that excuse very hard. You know, I'm often even hesitant to use the word education because I think in some ways it all has these connotations of this current system, which is so screwed up. The deep problem with the educational system, I think, is that in many ways it is a zero-sum game for status of getting into the right schools, getting the right grades, and things like that. And so I think if you start a new education business, you can try to either work within that system, and so it's basically how you basically are playing a zero-sum game and you're helping people compete. So maybe that would be a business that would help people score higher on tests or something like that. And there's probably some value in that, even though it's fundamentally zero-sum. And then I think the non-zero-sum version is somehow matching, unappreciated talent with unmet needs. It's creating completely new value where none exists. And I certainly think the non-zero-sum version is the one that's the really exciting one we should work on.
So you say that, what important truth do you feel very few people agree with you on? And you talk about company, like you want to focus on a company in an area where people aren't really focusing, so it generates value. Do you feel your 20 under 20 program kind of demonstrates that? Like I feel from talking to some of them that they're doing what they feel other people expect of them. And of course, there are a lot of people doing what other people expect of them. So I guess I'm just asking, do you feel your program demonstrates these same values?
Well, everything, look, everyone operates in a social context. And so it's probably not entirely realistic to not have any social cues or not to listen to other people. Already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And so I don't think that it's correct to say that you're not going to imitate or you're going to operate outside of society or you're going to ignore things altogether. That's probably too extreme. But I do think that in anything people do, you have to always be aware of these kinds of social pressures and how powerfully they operate. I think the 20 under 20 program, at a very minimum, people had to break with the tracked thing they were doing, and that's probably a very fundamental way in which they were doing something quite different from what was socially expected. And I think thus far it seems to be working quite well. I don't want to go into all the details, but we're very optimistic with how it's tracked so far, the caliber of people, the originality of the kinds of projects they're working on. But it's a general problem that if I had one of the people once asked me, how would I answer the question? Tell me a truth that very few people agree with you on. And the slightly meta level answer I like to give is that the answer always to this question is always most people believe X, but I believe not X. So most people believe this is an easy question, but I think it is a hard question. Most people think originality is not that hard. I think it's extremely hard. It's extremely rare. And when you find it, it is extremely valuable.
Hello. Hi. I was just wondering if you could speak for a moment about seasteading and how you think that could help bring about the technological acceleration you called for.
Well, this is a fairly minor project I get involved in. It certainly was one of my friends, Patrick Friedman, was an engineer at Google and decided he wanted to explore the idea of creating new communities on the ocean. We've basically, I think this is still sort of a very futuristic kind of project. That's why it's done on a nonprofit basis at this point. I do think when we look at all the frontiers from the 1960s that were abandoned, space has been largely abandoned. But people also talked about the oceans. Oceans cover 72% of the world's surface area, and people, in the 60s imagined you could have underwater cities. There would be all sorts of new ways of living on the oceans. The deserts, people had visions of transforming the deserts into forests, arable farmland, all these sorts of things, and that's all been dialed back. So I think as we look for new frontiers, we should look at, not just the sort of urban centers where we find ourselves, but we should look at, the deserts, the oceans, ultimately outer space. So I think somehow the challenge of technology is a challenge of reopening the frontier, and part of that frontier, I think, should involve literally a geographic frontier.
Hello. Hi. Hi, Peter. My name is Omri, and I started a company in synthetic biology. And it took me almost 12 years of study and research in universities to understand what needs to be built. And if you want to solve big problems that require deep technical knowledge, how do you correlate that with, getting out of college early?
Well, it's first of all, my claim has never been that nobody should go to college. I went to college, and I think there certainly are many contexts in which it's important. You have to get a PhD if you want to become a professor. If you want to, and there's certain professional tracks where you have to go to college to get the requisite degrees. I do think that there are certainly areas where the limits of knowledge are very far, and you have to spend many years, maybe decades, studying things to get to the frontier. I don't think all areas are like this. Computer science certainly has not been one where you've classically had to spend your whole life. And there are a lot of people who've been able to start very successful software businesses where the critical thing was not pursuing some specific trajectory that is still going to take many years to get to the frontier, but to go in a different direction where the frontier was much closer. So I think if you had to generalize the question, it's a question about how far is the frontier of knowledge. And there is an academic version where it's really far, because you sort of see people in graduate school and postdoctoral schools, and it seems like there's never-ending series of things they're learning. But I often wonder whether there are other directions one can go in where the frontier is actually much, much closer. I think the bioinformatics area is very promising. Certainly, to my mind, it is too heavily dominated by priorities set by various academically tracked areas. And the question people have not asked enough is whether they're working on things that will actually have application and will actually have use. And that's a very different question from whether you can write papers that get published in Science or Nature magazine and help you get tenure. And so we're in a world where academic research is esoteric and non-applied, and technology is sort of very, very applied, and there needs to be much more room for the in-between things. Not just things that have immediate application, and not things that are pure theory, but somehow a synthesis of the two. And I think that's an open challenge that we need to work on.
Hi, my name is Ralph Kunz, Patagonia Capital from Berlin. I have one question to your slide with technology innovation on the one axis and basically globalization the other. Now, if we look at innovation capabilities, obviously with the internet, theoretically could easily be spread out now all over the world. On the other hand, if you look at the value creation in tech, where has the value been created? It's still very strongly centered around the valley. So how do these, in your opinion, these two axes basically interact? On the one hand, sort of innovation capability that's actually globalizing, on the other hand, still value creation still pretty much focused at one spot.
Yeah, this is a good question. I don't necessarily have answers to all these questions, but I think it certainly is a strange paradox of the information age that while theoretically everyone in the world has access to information and everybody could be working on new problems, in practice things are extraordinarily centered on Silicon Valley. I think probably the conventional explanation for this would be that there are very powerful network effects involved in it. And these network effects are very critical because when you're going from 0 to 1, it's critical to be the first person. And so if you're in Silicon Valley, you're competing with all these other people, you have sort of a sense of what's, what really the frontier of knowledge is and whether you're working on something important. If you're working out of some small village, you might be the best technology business in that village, but it's not clear it's globally competitive. And for technology to work, it generally has to be the best in the world. There's some exceptions. There's the Chinese internet. There's certain parts of it that are sort of semi-closed off. But the fundamental, on a fundamental level, technology competition is global. And the great technology businesses have to be the best in the world. This is not true of all businesses. If you ran a hotel or a restaurant, you might do quite well if it was the best hotel or the best restaurant in a given city. You're not competing with restaurants halfway around the world or hotels halfway around the world. So most types of businesses actually have a very heavy local component. Technology, I think, tends to be necessarily globally competitive. And what makes it so hard is that you actually have to be the best in the world. And there is a way in which, if you're in a place where all the other people, many other people who are doing it are located, you have a better sense of that frontier. You have a sense of whether you're working on things that are actually potentially the best or whether they're just reinventing things people have done many times before. So that's my best explanation. Not sure it's right. I think in practice, there's going to be innovation both in Silicon Valley and outside of it in the decade ahead. And I think there will continue to be a lot in Silicon Valley, and I think there will be quite a lot in the rest of the world put together.
Hi. My name is Tim from Chrono24.com. How could governments support to develop countries? Imagine you'd be in the room with the G8 leaders. What would be the single most relevant advice you would give to the G8 leaders?
Well, I think certainly the starting point would be for this to be a priority. And so this is again very abstract, but I think the question of technology or science and innovation around these areas is not actually seen as a top priority. And so if you look at the G8, the main priorities today are macroeconomics. They're how much money do we print or not print? How do it's various things like that. They're not really focused on science or technology. And so if you had to look at the U.S. specifically, and I'll just talk about the U.S. because I'm most familiar with that. We have 100 senators, 435 Congress people. By a generous count, maybe 35 out of 535 have a background in science, technology, engineering. The rest of them are basically in the Middle Ages. They do not know that windmills don't work when the wind is not blowing, or that solar panels do not work at night. And so I would say that the first step towards having more of a role for government would be to have government leaders who actually understand science and technology. I personally end up coming out somewhat on the sort of classical liberal or libertarian side, and I'm skeptical of it. But if I was more on the pro-government side, I would start by changing the people who make up the government.
Peter, hi. That actually sort of trumps the question I was going to ask you, which was, I think you would agree that the U.S. political system and the system of government is somewhat broken in the United States, and separate and apart from that obvious and great comment that you just made, what would you do to change the system, how people get elected, how things get done, how we fix the priorities and focus and attack real problems in society?
After all, it still is the same system. And this is also true in Western European countries. There's a sense in which the politics seems angrier and more dysfunctional in many different countries. But the system itself has not actually changed. And so the premise in your question that there's something is wrong with the system, I'm not actually sure that's entirely correct. I'll give you a sort of an alternate explanation of what's going on, which is that in a world where there's not enough technological, scientific, and economic progress, and where people's living standards do not improve, the world becomes very zero-sum. And everyone for every winner, there is a loser. and you only make money by taking it from other people. The pie does not grow. It simply gets reshuffled in various ways. And I think the various Western political systems do not work very well when the pie is not growing, because they work by compromise and consensus, and you get to compromise if you say you have people around the table and you figure out a solution where there's a little bit more for everybody at the table. And that sort of compromise only works when you have a growing pie. And so I actually think that we somehow have to get the technology progress accelerating more. And if we do, the political system will work. If you don't, I think people will just be extremely angry because they will understand that they can only get more by taking it from other people. And that makes so I focus more on substance, less on process.
Axel Ruger of the Van Gogh Museum. On a completely different question, because we were talking a lot about science and technology and so forth, but it warmed my heart, of course, that also in the top left quadrant you also place the arts. And I'm just wondering whether you could talk a bit more about that and the room for experiment and what the role of the arts in this, in the future, in the acceleration of growth really might be, because at the moment we also see in arts funding a real retrenchment towards the tried, tested and true and what we know and blue chip names and so forth. So how do you see that in that sort of, entire continuum?
I'm sort of, I think they're very similar to the question of technology. The challenge in some ways that's maybe even more pronounced in the arts than in the area of technology is this question of originality and what what counts as original. And so it always gets sort of it gets very complicated because you sort of have this thing where all the fashionable people wear black clothes, but they all end up looking alike. And so this question of how do you get something that's authentically different rather than just everyone being different in exactly the same way is, I think, sort of a very, very deep challenge. And it probably, it again comes down to people pursuing their passions, having some capacity in our society to support that, and not this sort of herd-like consensus approach. But I think if everything was fine and we could just be static, and there was just the machine just sort of worked, you would have no need for either art or engineering. It would just be a static world. It might decelerate, but this would be sort of the optimistic, indefinite world that I think we had for the last quarter century. And I think that world has hit a watershed with the financial crisis of 07, 08. And at this point, we really need to do new things. And that necessarily means that there is more room for creativity and for the whole range of spectrum of the arts. And it's much more important than it was in a world where everything was fine and you just had to turn the crank on the machine and it would work.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm Elizabeth Taylor. Yes, Elizabeth Taylor. And I just have a question about the acceleration model you showed us. I guess we all love acceleration, we love growth, but I'm just wondering, an important truth I believe is that maybe perhaps we should de-accelerate, since growth acceleration is kind of having rather harmful effects on human beings. I mean, for example, in Africa we had the dumping of all the different computers and those chemicals harming the residents living there. And yet we talk about design being human-centric. So I guess I just see the acceleration model and having user-centered design at being odds with each other. So I was just wondering your thoughts.
Probably the caveat I should have put on this was not, it was sort of good acceleration, or it's not technological innovation per se, but it's good technological innovation, where good would include not just improved economic well-being, but also improved quality of life, some sort of sustainability about the environment. Obviously, if you simply have the economy do better, but you destroy the environment, that's the collapse model. So so the world you're describing is one that's headed not towards its acceleration leading to collapse, which is not acceleration at all. Now, to repeat the challenge, though, I would say I believe there are only 4 charts you can draw. You can draw acceleration, deceleration, cycles, or collapse. There are a lot of problems with acceleration, and the big risks with it are that it's bad acceleration. So maybe the development of nuclear weapons was a form of technological progress that was a bad form of technological progress. Or you have unsustainable acceleration, which may be what's happening in a number of environmental issues. But I think, but I do believe that technological acceleration is absolutely critical at this point, because the other three models are worse. And just to give a very basic example is we have about 1 billion people who live in the developed world. There are about 6 billion in the developing or emerging market countries. And if you simply did not have any technological progress and you try to get those 6 billion people to the living standard of the developed world, you would have a complete environmental, resource-driven collapse. And then I don't think you can say, well, they should not develop, they should not progress, they should just stay living in their villages without refrigerators or any sort of technology. So, because I think that's not a real option. I think the only way forward is through more technological progress, with all the risks that it entails. Because I think, I think the alternative is to condemn, billions of people to poverty, which I think will not be acceptable. I don't think that's acceptable to China. I don't think it's acceptable to any other country. And because I agree with you that the current model is not entirely sustainable, my inference is that we have to actually move forward even faster.
Hi. Hi, Peter. Robert Norden from Sedition. Yesterday, John Mader talked about his life in 4 quarters, 0 to 25, 25, 50, 50, 75, 75, 100. And you hear a lot about education in the first quarter, right? The 0 to 25 is your program itself. There's also this urge with singularity technology to maybe think of life having additional segments and going on for longer periods than we currently imagine. Regardless of whether that's the case, how do you think the developed world should look at the last 2 quarters, the 50 to 75 and the 75 to 100? And how do you think the developed world is doing in terms of valuing those assets and those people?
Well, I would hope we don't necessarily end at 100, but even though, I think that, I think people always say that, people often say, you should live every day as though it's your last, which always strikes me as a very pessimistic view on life. And I think you should actually live every day as though it's going to go on forever. And so every day should be so awesome and so great that you'd be happy if it would be like this, not just for the next 50 or 100 years, but indefinitely. And I think so I think I think the question we have to ask when people think about it, these things is, what sense of the future do people have? Are there things they think they can, meaningfully improve and work on? And I think that if we're not going to have a super pessimistic society in which everyone's just dejected, you have to have this view that wherever you are in your life, there are some meaningful things you can do, there are ways you can make the future better, and the sort of optimism about the future is not something that should be limited to people in their 20s. We have to find a way for that to be true at all these levels. And certainly when we have this radical duality between education and life, where you learn and then you leave school and you stop learning, there's a profound pessimism that's part of it, which is that there's nothing you can learn that's worth the effort. And of course that becomes self-fulfilling at some point. So you have to actually believe that there are meaningful things you can do and improve yourself. And it's hard. We all have all these priorities, but it's something I certainly try to block off long weekends, read a book, discuss it with various people, just do various structured types of things to advance my thinking. And I think we should all try to do that.
Hi, I'm Leah Bites from North Zone.
Last question. So you got the last question.
Oh dear. No pressure. So, as you, I try to be a contrarian investor. And as a VC, I think it comes with often underrated responsibility in shaping the future. Not because the companies that are backed will be the building blocks of the future society, but at least they stand a greater chance. And I was wondering, what advice do you have on investors trying to find real game changers and sort of breaking off of the common mold that often is feeding this monster of people doing jobs they don't enjoy, to, you know, buy stuff they don't need, to impress people they don't like?
Well, these are all things one should try to resist, and we should not exaggerate or make it sound easy to resist. And I think, I think in both an entrepreneurial and a venture capital context, we always like to style ourselves as very original and as able to think for ourselves, but we are under tremendous social pressures. And when there are these long time horizons where it might take 5, 7, 10 years before you know whether something's really working, you often want to get faster feedback, and often a lot of the feedback ends up being social in nature. I don't want to dismiss all of that, but you end up in this zone. And I think I think it's an endemic problem in Silicon Valley that the venture capital thinking is very herd-like. There are clearly these fashions and trends, and they're not necessarily supported by any of the data. My own approach is generally to try to be anti-thematic. I think that once you have a theme and say, this is something that's going to happen, it's either too late or there are too many people doing it. And I think all great businesses have a unique narrative, and there's a unique story. And it's a story about what they're doing that nobody else is doing. One other version of the question, I sort of gave the intellectual and business version of the question. One question I often like to ask people at the very beginning when they're starting companies, and this is it's very acute in Silicon Valley, but I think there's a European version that probably is also quite powerful. And it is, yeah, if you're the 2 or 3 people starting a company, that's cool. You get to be the founder, the CEO, whatever title you give yourself. But why will the 20th talented person join your company when they can go to work at Google or Facebook, have a very safe, very well-paying job that looks very good on their resume? And what story are you going to tell the 20th person to join your company? And it normally does not work that everything will be working so great at the business that it'll obviously be spectacularly successful. It's not an economic story. The economic story never works. And I find that probably well under 10% of the people I talk to have a halfway decent answer to that question alone. So it's always a unique, a unique thematic story. You have to obviously, and again, I think being contrarian is not the only thing. It was a 3-part Venn diagram. It also has to be true. It has to be something you have some competence in. And so if it's simply contrarian, there are a lot of ideas that nobody agrees with that are just wrong. Most ideas that most people do not agree with are wrong. I think this is worth underscoring. But it's really finding the intersection. And the version of it I like to ask is, why is the 20th person going to join this company? Thank you very much.